let's talk about Bitcoin. So I got way into Bitcoin as a concept back in the early 2000s, I guess. It would have been 2009, 8, something like that. And I had been reading about it for a while, mostly on Slashdot, news for nerds, stuff that matters, right? And they would talk about this concept. And it actually really coincided with my interest in money and currency in general, just as a concept, right? Money is fascinating. Money is like gravity. It's a force of nature that moves things, right? It puts things in motion and keeps them in orbit. This has always been my analogy about money. And the most interesting thing about money, at least in the modern world, is that it really doesn't exist. It's a concept. It's honestly a mass delusion. Some would say a mass agreement. But if you look at the history of money and what made money money, right? It had certain properties, right? Money should be fungible, right? Meaning one piece of money should be worth the same as another piece of money. It shouldn't matter, collectible values aside. And after the financial crash of 2008, I was really fed up with what I saw going on in our economy. If you look at the US dollar, if you really understand it, how money is created, the more you understand, the less you believe in it, which is ironic because the only value that the US dollar has is pegged to our faith in the full faith and credit of the United States to repay its debts, right? So as long as you believe the dollar is worth something, it is. This is the truth. A lot of people still to this day think things that the dollar is backed by gold, like Fort Knox. We've got a big vault full of gold somewhere. I mean, we do have strategic gold reserves, but they have no relation to the value of the dollar. Since we got off the gold standard and moved to completely fiat-based currency, meaning it's only worth something because our government says it is and we trust the government. The problem I was seeing back in 2008 was not only do not a lot of people trust the government, but that level of faith is going down and that level of trust is going steadily down every year, right? The US actually has a credit rating. We have a credit score. It's usually AAA, but it occasionally dips into AA, based on many things, including our debt to GDP ratio and other things. So the real power in this world is who controls the money supply. That's why the US has maintained global domination for as long as it has. Once the world moved off of the pound sterling and onto the dollar as the world reserve currency, that gave us immense amounts of power as a country. And now, even now, Trump has started to signal that, if anybody tries to unseat the dollar as the world reserve currency, there's going to be trouble. He's one of the first, if not the first, president I've ever heard openly say that. To me, that's a sign that we are closer than ever towards the dollar being unseated. Now, does that take place this year? In 100 years? Probably somewhere within that time frame, but possibly a lot sooner. World events move so much faster than they ever moved before. And there are multiple viable alternatives to the dollar emerging, from BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China getting together, and their stated goal is to create a financial system completely outside of the dollar so that they can avoid sanctions. Iran is part of that coalition as well. This will signal the true power in the world is who controls the reserve currency. But I digress. Back to the dollar. People don't even understand how dollars are made, like where money comes from. A lot of people think, the mint, we've got mints and they're printing sheets of money and that's the money supply. Not even close. Not even a small fraction of money is created in that way. In fact, most of the currency that's printed and minted is simply to replace currency that's been destroyed, right? Like paper money that is no longer in circulation. They destroy certain amounts, they print more. Real money in our world is created by banks. A lot of people think that if you put your money in a bank, they take your money and it's sitting there in the vault, right? And you can go anytime and get it all. Everybody could go and just take their money out of the bank, right? Wrong. That's a run on the bank. The reason they don't and are not required to cover all that money is because a couple reasons. One, most people will not all come at the same time and withdraw their money. That's the bottom line. Two, we have federal deposit insurance for up to, I think it's $250,000 per account to protect people from running, to give us faith in the banks, right? But how do the banks create more money? This is the crazy part. So banks use what's called the fractional reserve system, meaning they only need to have a certain percentage of the money you deposited actually on hand. Right? For every dollar that they have in the bank, they are then allowed to loan additional dollars, something like $9. Sometimes it's more. But so if you deposit $1 in your bank account, that gives the bank to create $9 on paper by loaning it to someone, right? They create a loan and they issue that money to somebody's account. It doesn't exist. It didn't come from anywhere. It sprang from thin air. Money is created out of debt, right? Debt obligations are what ends up creating money, which is central to why the Federal Reserve and their interest rates, which theoretically set the interest rate at which banks can borrow money, which they can then lend to other people, is primary to our economy, right? And we've been in big trouble for a long time. Interest rates right now, a lot of people consider them high and really want the Fed to lower the interest rate, including the president-elect. However, if you look historically, the interest rate where it's at is historically low, right? Compared to where we've been in the 70s, 80s, etc. We've become addicted to cheap and free money that we've been injecting into the economy to shore us up after bubbles pop. After 2008, when the financial wizards of Wall Street almost destroyed the entire banking system, President Obama came in, allowed them to be completely bailed out with no legal ramifications, right? No bankers went to jail, even though they committed blatant fraud, right? I've talked to a lot of people and they said, well, Dan, it's very complicated. Derivatives and all these complicated financial structures. We didn't have the laws we didn't know the stuff they were doing was bad. We didn't know it was illegal. So, they get a pass. That's BS, right? We have laws against fraud. And what these lenders were doing was patently fraudulent, right? They would issue these subprime loans. They would specifically target low income and minority communities and offer them cheap loans, right? This is what led to an enormous bubble in the real estate market, okay? And then they would take those loans, which they knew had a very good chance of default because these were what are called subprime loans, right? These were loans that were lent to people that were risky, right? So you had a bunch of loans. Each piece was a bunch of shit. You stick them in a stack, put them together, and then slice them this way. Slice them up into little chunks and sell those as derivatives, collateralized debt obligations, okay? And you're in bed with the investment ratings agencies whose job it is to tell you how good an investment opportunity, how risky an investment opportunity is. And they called these things AAA loans, even though they were riddled with, marbled with, if you will, craptacular loans that had very little chance of being paid off, especially if interest rates started to go up or prices started to fall, both of which ended up happening, right? They almost destroyed our economy. This is what got me thinking that if our faith, if the dollar's value is based on the full faith and credit, and our people's faith in our government has only been going down. I mean, and since 2008, would you say the average person's faith in government has gone up or gone down? I don't think there's any question that we're on a steady downward trajectory of faith. The question is, how much faith do we have in the bank, right? How far do you have to go before you hit a tipping point where the dollar, there's not enough faith in the U.S. economy to keep the dollar as the reserve currency? I believe we're on the precipice of that. I believe not only are we going to see it in our lifetime, we have a real possibility of seeing it within the next decade, if not sooner. The pace of change in the world has grown dramatically, right? And besides BRICS, which I talked about a second ago, we also have to worry or think about Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin. Who created Bitcoin? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. We have a name, Satoshi Nakamoto, who put out the famous Bitcoin white paper that really explained that the motivation for creating Bitcoin was the financial crisis and the lack of faith in the dollar. Okay, so back then, I owned a comic book store. I didn't make a ton of money, but I loved what I was doing. I was doing okay. I had a little bit of money in the bank. And I'm also a gambler. And I'm also a tech enthusiast. So I've been following Bitcoin for quite some time when it started in the pennies per Bitcoin era. And, I watched it steadily moving over a course of, a couple of years. And I saw it moving closer to the $100 range. And that's when I told myself, I said, hey, Dan, you would be willing to pay $1,000 to play in a poker tournament to get you into the World Series of Poker. I never have, but I'm willing to, and I hope to someday. I'm willing. I'm a gambler, so I like to, I don't mind risking a little bit of money. I have investments in the stock market that have done okay. But I said, hey, why not take a little bit of money and put it into this Bitcoin thing? You never know. So at that time, Bitcoin was about $90. $90 each. And to get them, though, was kind of difficult. You had to order them. At that time, the only way I knew of to get a Bitcoin was to purchase them through the only Bitcoin exchange that I was aware of at that moment was called MTGOX, which stood for Magic the Gathering Online Exchange. Yeah, it was a Magic card trading site that became the first Bitcoin exchange operating out of Japan, right? So I had to go through a few financial hoops to try and figure out how to get my money into this thing. But I bought 10 Bitcoin, $90 each, spent about $900. If you go look at the price of Bitcoin right now, I believe it's hovering around $95,000 per coin after coming off a high of 105,000. And if you believe the hype, it's got room to grow a lot more. Depends who you listen to. If you listen to a lot of people, what everyone pretty much told me when I was talking about Bitcoin, I was never like a huge, like, you should put your whole life into this, or this is the next big thing. I said, hey, it's very interesting. And here's why. Because I was into the currency side, I was into cryptology and cryptography rather, and technology and how those work together. And once I finally understood, it was really one piece. It was the idea of how can you have a digital token to spend that doesn't have a central server like PayPal, for instance. How can you spend that and not be able to spend it again, right? That was the brilliance of the blockchain and Bitcoin. If you're familiar with it, and if you're not, there's plenty of videos that can describe that to you. But it was cracking that double spend problem and understanding how that worked that finally said, hey, this took me a minute to understand, and I already understood public and private key cryptography. So the fact that I understood it, and most people didn't even have a hope of understanding it in those early days, right? The knowledge wasn't there, the awareness wasn't there, and especially the technical knowledge of cryptography was not widespread. Still isn't. But at that time, I felt like I knew something that the average person didn't know. And even that the average investor, the highly technical people that rate investments, they had no clue about any of this stuff. They had no idea why the white paper and the concept of the blockchain and Bitcoin was revolutionary. There's a lot of speculation that Satoshi Nakamoto is not a person at all, but that the Bitcoin project was started by some kind of national player, a nation state. I've heard many, I'm not going to indulge in that kind of speculation because I have nothing to back it up. But the fact is that the white paper, it was sending shockwaves, and people were seeing this price of Bitcoin rising. And when it hit $100, it started getting a lot more attention, right? And that's when it really started kind of going nuts. But as people started to understand the, fairly complicated concept behind Bitcoin, especially if you're not into technology and cryptography, it really is kind of tough to figure out why it's revolutionary and why it's even useful. The whole mining scenario and how the Bitcoin are created and how it was meant to be analogous to a physical gold mine, meaning that the Bitcoin miners can mine Bitcoin, but the longer you go, the further down in that mine you go, the farther it is to extract the coins or the gold, right? That's the idea behind Bitcoin, which makes it, in concept, in theory, a mildly deflationary currency, meaning it should be going up in value steadily, as opposed to fiat debt-based currencies, which are kind of the opposite, and they've been steadily declining in value. So these concepts made me fascinated, right? I'm a money nerd, and I'm not a rich guy. I just really fascinated by the concept of money. Things that do not exist, something that does not really exist, but yet dominates. Cash rules everything around me, right? Money is what makes the world go round in so many ways. It makes people stay in jobs they hate. It makes them move places they never would have moved before. And it just has so many effects. It's almost impossible to measure the effect that money has on the entire world, every part of the world. And so anyway, all this stuff was super fascinating to me. And let me get into Bitcoin. So I bought 10 Bitcoin. If I had kept them all, I'd have like almost $1 million worth of Bitcoin right now. But you know, over those time, I spent some of them. I used some. I don't have all of them anymore. I spent some to get when my wife had just given birth, and we needed a drug that you could only get in Canada that had an off-label side effect that would help her producing milk for our newborn baby. I spent some on that. When we flipped our car over in a car accident, I had to buy a new car. I spent a little bit of Bitcoin to get there. By that time, it had gone up into the thousands, 20, even up into 20,000. And we've seen the values go up and go down and go up and go down. And everybody out there who's skeptical of it are suddenly they're experts, right? They know that, oh, there's nothing behind it. It's a tulip scam, right? It's a tulip bubble. There's nothing there. It's useless. There's no physical value behind it. Never thinking about the fact that there is no physical value behind their dollar either, right? And that it's all faith-based. That's all money is faith. So as we see faith decreasing in the dollar and increasing in cryptocurrencies and alternatives to the dollar, this is a big part of the reason why we've seen Bitcoin climb to 100 grand. And if you believe people, it's got a lot more to climb. They're talking about issuing a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Trump was originally very against Bitcoin years ago in his statements, but it's definitely come around thanks to the influence of all these Silicon Valley billionaires that got him elected, right? And what they're talking about doing is a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And the way they would do this, they would take the U.S. gold reserves, remember, which are not tied to our currency value in any way. There's no peg between gold and the dollar. But that strategic U.S. gold reserve is valued at a book value of, I believe, $41 an ounce. So what they're talking about is recalculating the value of the existing gold stores in the United States at market value. Gold is almost $2,000 an ounce. So there's a big spread between $40 and a couple thousand. That would create billions, if not trillions, but I think it's billions of dollars on paper if you wanted to. And then the idea is that the Federal Reserve then takes that money and invests in a strategic Bitcoin reserve equal essentially to the amount of gold that we have in reserve. What would that do? That would put a floor on the price of Bitcoin because it's supported by the government who's buying, is a net buyer and is not spending. This could have a couple of effects. One, people could cash out at these high levels because the problem with Bitcoin at the moment is liquidity. It's very easy. You could sell a Bitcoin or two or three or 100 or whatever. It takes time. The fees are pretty expensive. You can look into how that works. I'm not here to talk about that. But because of that, the fees are outrageous, right? And there's a liquidity issue, meaning if you are a company like MicroStrategy or one of the others that have invested big time in Bitcoin and have billions in Bitcoin, then you're going to have a real problem if you ever wanted to sell those things. Like if the price of Bitcoin started to crash and people started to sell, you're going to have a run on the Bitcoin bank because you're going to have more sellers than you have buyers. You're not going to be able to sell your coin. The price is going to crash. If the U.S. government, though, were buying billions and billions of dollars in Bitcoin, then that perhaps might allow people to cash out. Or, as the Bitcoin adherents will tell you, it will double, triple the current price of Bitcoin, and we could be looking at a $250,000 Bitcoin within a matter of years. So what do I think is going to happen? I really don't know. I feel like what I have left in Bitcoin, I'm keeping, I'm hodling, I'm holding, but I sold the majority of what I had. I have a little left. It's sort of my own reserve. Maybe I'll pay off my mortgage with it. I paid off my first mortgage a while back, but I got another one. And if the remaining amount of Bitcoin that I have left exceeds the cost of the mortgage, I've considered selling then in order to be debt free. But in the meantime, I'm just watching and I'm fascinated. I feel like my point of view is a little bit different than most. I'm not a Bitcoin cheerleader. I recognize the tremendous energy costs. I recognize some of the fundamental flaws with using it as an actual like payment currency system. There's high costs of transaction and the speed is not terrific. So there's differences between Bitcoin and the dollar, and also between various other forms of cryptocurrency that popped up in the wake of this, right? You got so many different currencies, each of which have different kind of niches. Some are just shit coins, scams, rug pulls, nothing behind them other than hype that the creators use to build a bubble, pull the rug, cash out. But there's others like Ethereum and some others that have very interesting technical details about them that make it different than Bitcoin, make it less energy intensive, make it spend faster, etc. But really, Bitcoin is the whale, right? Bitcoin is the one. Bitcoin was the first mover and is most people are banking on Bitcoin being the one to last. So what do I tell you to do? I don't know. Think about it. You can buy a Bitcoin has, I think it's 12 digits after the decimal point. So you don't have to get in for $100,000. You don't have to get in for $1,000. You could get in for a little bit. You could buy fractional amounts of Bitcoin if you wanted to. And just like I own a small amount of gold in my portfolio, I also own an amount of Bitcoin. So think about it, consider it, look into the history. I'm going to be back and I'm going to talk more about money really soon. Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing, liking this video if you're into it. If you don't like it, you can dislike it. Please leave a comment. Tell me, what do you think about Bitcoin? What do you think about the past, present, and future of Bitcoin? And we'll see you next time.